this power structure that seems so real can shift within minutes or hours, during revolutions anyway, when people withdraw this consent. The outward manifestation of support and consent, when that's withdrawn, obedience is withdrawn. And when obedience is withdrawn, these systems start to crumble very quickly sometimes. Gandhi said it in one sentence: "For even the most powerful cannot rule without consent of the ruled." So, this leads us to what Sharp referred to as the second theory of power, the pluralistic theory of power. This sees power as a transaction. Ultimately, the ruler can give decrees, the CEO can make policies, but ultimately those policies have to be carried out. And we well know what tools, persuasion, economic reward, if that doesn't work, sanctions, getting fired from your job, for example, or imprisonment or other things, a ruler can try to do to compel obedience. But those tools don't necessarily always compel obedience, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. What we saw in Egypt, we saw those tools used, and they didn't work. They were not sufficient. We've seen these used in many, many other conflicts, some of which I listed there, and they weren't sufficient. And if you accept this pluralistic theory of power, that power is based on consent, and I mean, we can illustrate it right now. If each of you started tapping on the table, I couldn't talk. I need all of your consent to be here. Thank you very much. But you could take it away like that, and I'd just be some guy sitting here talking. So, power is fragile. And this is the good news for grassroots nonviolent movements, because this means that they can, if they're giving the system power with their actions, with their day-to-day behaviors, microtransactions, just the mundane things, the products that they buy, the amount of TV they watch, the kinds of institutions that they go to, the ways in which they talk at school or at functions, going to their job, paying their taxes, doing their job, all of these small interactions. If that's what holds things up, then when people shift their behavior, again, acts of omission, acts of commission, the balance of power in society can really start to shift. It can really start to shift. People can direct it. The challenge, of course, is how do they all act together? How do they act systematically, strategically, collectively together to do this? Now, my colleague, Peter Ackerman, who has been in this field now for over 30 years and wrote his dissertation looking at different strategic principles and other factors that contributed to the success or failure of different nonviolent movements, came up with a significant list of many, many different factors, and he later had to squash that list down into 12 factors when he published a book. But when he gave lectures, 12 principles was too many. So he distilled it down to 3. 3 really core key principles that contribute to nonviolent movement success. So it's interesting when you hear in the media these days speculation about where's the next revolution going to happen, where could it happen, where might it happen, or oh, are the people in this country going to be successful? A quick question for you to ask yourself is, I wonder if this movement has unity, I wonder if it has strategic planning, and I wonder if it has nonviolent discipline. And I realize I should do a time check right now before going for it. Okay, I'll take another 10, 15 minutes. I've been told this is okay. So, unity. One thing that movements do is they're able to unify people on a vision of what they want. And frequently it's not just, I'm going to give you, in this system you're going to have this, 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 and here are the new policies we're going to have. It's often as well on an issue of values. So here's one of the great unifying statements, in the history of civil resistance, drawn from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. King also, you'll note, anyone who's followed the movement knows, he was a minister, and his use of Christian imagery, symbols, values as well was woven into that movement. So he was calling on people as Americans, those who believed in or were devout in their Christianity as well. He was calling to them. He was calling to them for justice. He was speaking at the level of values. And this is frequently, if you look at another statement, this is a long one, I'll just read a few parts. This was put out in Egypt by a coalition of youth movements during the revolution. Fellow great Egyptian citizens, we are your daughters, your brothers and sisters, ... The matter goes beyond figures in particular to the whole administration of the Egyptian state, which was transformed from a servant of the people to a master of them. And I'll go ahead a little bit. The dignity of life and security of the Egyptian people is far more valuable than any single person's dignity, no matter how high a position he holds. They're speaking in a language of values here. They're saying, who are the Egyptians here? We're the Egyptians. It doesn't matter who this one person is in this government building. We are a family. They're using the imagery of family right at the beginning. And it's this kind of language, not only this kind of language, but one of the characteristics of movements that have been able to unify people is that they can frequently find values shared by many people and bring people together on those values. They also, movements build diverse participation. In 2005, there was a movement in Egypt called Kifaya, which means enough in Arabic. And without going into too much detail, one of the issues that Kifaya had is that they took a stance on an issue, I believe it was the wearing of the veil, that certain Islamist groups disagreed with. And this really hurt their base of support potentially because suddenly they had picked an issue that really divided. Whereas if you look at the recent Egyptian revolution, what was being chanted? Muslim, Christian, we are all Egyptian. There was, we are going to make sure that in our choice of issues and language, we are appealing to as broad a base as we can. And student movements that want to achieve things that relate directly to students, sure, they may be sufficient to get that by themselves. But if they want to achieve something societal change, they better find a way to get labor in there. They better find a way to get many, many other constituencies in there and be able to talk larger than themselves, which requires, among other things, listening. And one thing that people don't know frequently is the amount of listening, for example, that Gandhi did before he even launched the Salt March. How many people here know about the Salt March? For those of you who don't, there's a great film called A Force More Powerful that outlines it as well. You could watch the film Gandhi. One of the most brilliant nonviolent tactics in history. I'm just going to push ahead. They also plan. Movements that are successful frequently plan. I've got here Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, which I believe was finished in 600 BC. Know yourself, know your opponent, you will know the outcome of 100 battles. It's paraphrased, but that's... And what Sun Tzu is saying is that you can't develop a strategy unless you have a basis of facts and informed assumptions. You've got to figure out where you're strong, where the adversary is weak, how to concentrate strengths against weaknesses. You've got to figure out where to push. Movements don't have infinite strength. They have to figure out what the next step is. This is based on analysis. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to keep going. One quick thing is that if you look, here's sort of a graphic depiction. At the top of this triangle is a movement's vision. Once they figured out their vision that unifies people, they develop campaigns, major aspects of their movement for change, and then tactics, specific actions to further those campaigns, to further their vision. And when a movement is working really well, you see all those arrows reinforcing each other into the vision. They're all headed in the same direction. Tactics reinforce campaigns, which reinforce vision. So for example, if you look at the US Civil Rights Movement, the vision, voting rights and desegregation, campaigns, Nashville lunch counter sit-ins is one, Montgomery bus boycotts is another, the Freedom Rides is another, tactics, boycotts, strikes, demonstrations, etc., etc. And just as a contrast, here's my image of a movement that's not coordinated. They got lots of good ideas and they just can't figure out which direction to go. So everyone's kind of doing their own thing, and there's no momentum. And coming back to Sun Tzu, here's what Sun Tzu had to say about that. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And finally, nonviolent movements that are successful remain nonviolent. This goes without saying, but I'll say it briefly. Nonviolence increases participation among people. Lots of people will not participate in a violent movement. Lots of people will in a nonviolent one. It also makes it much more difficult for an adversary to repress a movement. There are a whole host of other reasons, but I won't go into those right now. New developments. one new development that's not being looked at by the media as much is the spread of knowledge. I would